Hello friends, my name is JJ, and over the last few years, Mario games have been progressing in a more realistic direction. They're still full of goofy cartoon characters and all of that, but as video game graphics continue to get better, the world Mario lives in is also starting to resemble the real world that we live in more and more. A good example of this is the food from Mario Kart World. Instead of mushrooms and leaves and things, in this game, Mario and his pals actually eat the sort of real-life human food that you could literally buy for yourself at shops and restaurants. And I know this because, check it out. So I literally bought all of the same foods for myself at shops and restaurants. So for anyone who hasn't played the game, at various points in Mario Kart World, you pick up little takeout bags, not unlike this one, at various drive-thrus and food trucks scattered around the courses. You eat them to get a speed boost, or if you are one of the humanoid characters, a snazzy new outfit. But my personal fascination with these meals comes from just how culturally particular they are. They're not just any old random foods. They're these super familiar, super beloved dishes that seem to have been specifically chosen by the designers for their ability to evoke strong feelings of affection and nostalgia in the player, at least assuming the player is American or Japanese. Mario Kart World features around 30 unique meals in all, and today I thought it might be fun to go through them one at a time and tell you a bit about their cultural history and importance, as well as a bit about the various places where I bought these real-world versions of them. Even if you're not a Mario Kart fan, I'm hoping you will still enjoy this little tour of what at least a few guys in Japan think of as the most beloved foods of the 21st century. Okay, so let us start with what is probably my personal favorite of all of these, the fish and chips basket. Fish and chips is a real comfort food for me. I have fond memories of when my dad would bring it home for the family after work. I got these ones at Cockney Kings, a very iconic chain here in Vancouver. Fish and chips is British in origin, and British historians usually credit it to the influence of Jewish immigrants from Portugal who had sought safe refuge in England during that fanatic period of 16th century religious persecution known as the Inquisition. Fried cod had been a delicacy in Portugal, where the fish was an exotic import from the Americas, but as it turned out, the waters around England were full of them, and this provided the refugees with an obvious way to make a living in this new country. Through their unique method of fish cooking, the Portuguese are usually considered the inventors of modern deep frying, which is to say coating a food in a floury batter and then frying it in oil. They would later introduce this concept to the Japanese, who called it tempura, which is probably a mangled version of the Portuguese word tempero, which means seasoning. Strips of potato fried in oil, meanwhile, have been a common European food since at least the 18th century, around 200 years after potatoes were first brought to Europe from the Americas. It is pretty debatable and probably unknowable which European country was the first to create them in the form we know today. France is the obvious candidate given the name, but historically they've also been associated with Belgium and Germany. Calling them chips is a distinctly British term dating to the Victorian era, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, with the first documented use of the phrase fish and chips being 1887, which is a fair bit later than the first fish and chips restaurants are said to have opened, which the BBC says was probably sometime in the 1860s. If you've ever wondered why fish and chips are traditionally wrapped in newspaper, it's because for a long time it was a very cheap and affordable meal for Britain's working class, and newspaper was a cheap and affordable wrapping for the working class shop owners. And speaking of chips, there are 3 different flavors of the American kind in Mario Kart World. The first type is just plain potato chips. I just got this bag of Lay's, which is my favorite brand at the local 7-Eleven. Potato chips are an American invention created at a fancy restaurant in Saratoga Springs, New York, sometime in the 1850s. There's a popular legend that they were created in a botched attempt to annoy a customer with a gross version of French fries, but this probably isn't true. In any case, they proved to be a huge hit, and so-called Saratoga chips were a popular snack with Americans during the late 19th century, and an example of a new food product that really took off in large part due to emergent factory technology of the time that allowed simple foods to be quickly manufactured at a massive scale. It wasn't until after World War II, however, that flavored chips started to be a thing. In the game, they have spicy jalapeno flavored chips, which are a pretty popular flavor these days. Here's a bag of jalapeno chips I got at the 7-Eleven as well. Made by Mrs. Vicky's, which is a popular Canadian brand that's now actually owned by the Lay's people, who are in turn owned by Pepsi. Jalapenos, as the name might suggest, are vegetables native to Spanish-speaking Mexico, Central and South America being the ancestral home of most of the world's breeds of chili peppers. As food and people from that part of the world influenced the US more and more, American appetites for spicy things steadily increased over the years, with the first jalapeno-flavored chips having emerged in Texas in the 1980s, where obviously Mexican cultural influences are pretty strong. Jalapenos by that point would have already been well established as a traditional topping on that other great, iconic Mexican-American chip dish, nachos. And thirdly, the game also features a bag of banana chips. These things have become a pretty popular snack for the health-conscious set in recent years. I bought this bag at good old Whole Foods. They're lower in fats and carbs than potato chips, but much higher in trans fats and sugar. Bananas are also indigenous to Central America, but the tradition of eating banana chips is said to come from India, which is actually the largest banana-producing nation on Earth. The tropical Indian state of Kerala, specifically, likes to take credit for inventing the chips. It's a state that not only produces plenty of bananas, but plenty of coconuts as well, making the idea of frying banana slices in coconut oil a pretty obvious conclusion to the Keralalians. Indian cuisine in general has emerged as one of the world's most iconic, and Mario Kart World has a bunch of other Indian-inspired dishes as well. The first one is an Indian curry platter with 2 or 3 small metal dishes of differently colored curries and what I assume is supposed to be a samosa and some naan bread. This is a palak paneer curry platter, which I got at Kinera on Davie Street, which is my favorite Indian place in Vancouver. Indians first started making curry with chili peppers in the 1500s after Portuguese traders brought them over from their colonies in the Americas. The whole idea of there even being a food called curry is a European thing as well, as Lizzie Collingham explains in this helpful book, Curry, A Tale of Cooks and Conquerors. No Indian would have referred to his or her food as a curry. The idea of a curry is in fact a concept that the Europeans imposed on India's food culture. Indians referred to their different dishes by specific names, and their servants would have served the British with dishes that they called, for example, Rogan Josh, Du Piazza, or Korma. But the British lumped all of these together under the heading of curry. The name curry itself is just a mangled version of a word from various South Indian languages that the Europeans had come to understand as meaning spicy. In any case, the British in particular really took to Indian curries during their time over there, and Indian migrants to Britain and America in the 20th century would have a lot of success popularizing their food in the West. The fact that the Japanese also really took to Indian food is a bit of a stranger phenomenon. This was probably my biggest food-related culture shock when I was living there, but it's true. The Japanese are huge fans of Indian food, with the Indian restaurant as much a staple of Japanese suburban life as the izakaya. The book says that the Japanese were probably introduced to curry during the Meiji era, the decades in the late 19th century when the country was going through a period of aggressive open-mindedness to Western ideas and imports. British merchant ships began arriving at ports, and they brought with them a wide range of new foods: bread, ice cream, pork cutlets, potato croquettes, hashed beef, and curry. It became very fashionable among the rising middle classes to eat these Western dishes. But curry wasn't a Western dish, of course, so the Japanese version of curry that subsequently emerged wound up being a Japaneseified version of a Britishified version of a broad interpretation of Indian food. And it's from this that we get Japanese curry, which is another food in the game. Japanese curry is now so far removed from Indian curry, it is basically a completely different food. And even in Japan itself, it's now treated as something distinct particularly as Indian immigration to that country increases, and with it, more authentic Indian cuisine. Japanese curry is basically the British stereotype of Indian food, reduced to its most simplistic essence, a sort of lightly spiced gravy poured over a lump of rice. Indians are often horrified by this, but it can be good on its own terms. There's a hole-in-the-wall place in Vancouver that specializes in Japanese curry, and it's quite popular. In the game, the Japanese curry is supposed to be volcanic spicy, which is probably an allusion to the sort of spiciness arms race you tend to see with ready-made Japanese supermarket curry. Check this out. I bought this at Konbinia, which is the big Japanese import store we have downtown. It says, "Maximum spicy danger zone." I'm sure it still barely tastes like anything by Indian standards. So there was a time when Mario games were a bit self-conscious about their Japanese roots. But in recent years, the series has started to lean into them a lot more, with a lot of explicitly Japanese-themed levels and characters. Mario Kart World has a very cool Japanese-themed level, complete with a few iconic Japanese foods. The first is just this charming sushi platter. Sushi is, of course, Japan's most famous food and probably one of the most iconic foods of any country, really. It's easy to assume that sushi is some very ancient meal consumed for centuries by this island nation of fishermen and rice eaters. But in reality, sushi, as we know it today, has only been around for about 200 years or so. In the 1800s, Japan underwent a lot of changes in its agricultural sector, which saw a dramatic growth in rice production. And it was only then that rice started to become a common and affordable food for the country's emerging middle class. Small blobs of rice topped with slices of raw fish became a very popular Tokyo street food in the mid-19th century, and then gradually a high-end restaurant food. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that sushi returned to being an affordable middle-class thing, which was partially due to an abundance of seafood after the war, including record imports of foreign fish. In the game's sushi platter, they have a couple of tuna pieces and one with salmon eggs. These are both very common types of sushi in modern Japan, but also reflect just how globalized sushi has become. Japan now imports a ton of its tuna from Mexico, while most of their salmon comes from Norway and Chile. According to this book, The Sushi Economy, Globalization, and the Making of a Modern Delicacy by Sasha Eisenberg, the first modern sushi restaurants in America popped up in Southern California in the 1970s. The food found a natural traction there, both because of the large Japanese-American population, as well as the general California inclination towards trendy, exotic foods that seem healthy and natural. The fact that sushi still had a relatively upscale reputation in Japan back then probably helped too. I like sushi a lot, but not really the kind depicted here, with either the fish on the top or in a seaweed roll, which are known as nigiri and maki. At my favorite sushi place, Well Sushi in New Westminster, they serve mostly uramaki, or rolls with the rice on the outside. This style of roll was actually invented in California, supposedly to hide the raw fish and seaweed from skeptical Americans. Uramaki rolls similarly tend to be quite American in that they usually feature a far greater mix of fillings and toppings than you see with traditional Japanese-style maki or nigiri, which are usually based around a single piece of fish, vegetable, or egg, as we see here. I really like Alaska rolls, for instance, which contain crab, avocado, cucumber, and sometimes cream cheese, topped with a slice of salmon, and slathered in teriyaki sauce. That sort of thing would strike a lot of Japanese people as being a little over the top, but it's also a reason why Western tourists can feel a little underwhelmed when they visit sushi restaurants in Japan. Speaking of fish and Japan, how about this guy, known as Takoyaki? Considerably more obscure than sushi, but there's actually a whole store that sells them at Metrotown, which is the biggest mall in the greater Vancouver area. Takoyaki literally means something like baked fish, and it is a fish-shaped pastry that's full of some sort of sweet filling. The most traditional is this red bean mush called anko, that the Japanese love to put in everything, but they also have ones filled with custard and chocolate and things like that. Takoyaki are very closely associated with Japanese street festivals, where they're cooked on the spot in these fun contraptions and served up piping hot. They've been one of Japan's most iconic snacks for over a century, first created in 1909 by a Tokyo street vendor. According to this Japanese food website, which interviewed the current owner of the original shop, there wasn't any particularly deep reason for the fish shape. The founder simply experimented with various different shapes and found that the fish ones sold best. That said, fish are also widely used as symbols of good luck in Japan, so I'm sure that didn't hurt. The Japanese level also has these bubbas, known as takoyaki, or octopus balls. These are perhaps my most favorite Japanese food of all, and are even part of this channel's lore. This thing I hang over my computer is a traditional takoyaki advertising banner. Much like taiyaki, takoyaki, or another very common festival food, made in a similarly flashy way. They're little balls of baked dough containing pieces of octopus, or in some cases, an entire baby octopus, which are then covered in special sauce, mayonnaise, and tuna flakes. A great deal of American Japanese restaurants serve them these days. I like to get them at this popular ramen place downtown called Kokoro Tokyo Maze Soba, which has the cool retro vibes of Japan's Showa era, or late 20th century. Takoyaki is so popular in modern Japan that it has affected the way that octopuses tend to be depicted in Japanese pop culture. You'll see in cartoons and video games and stuff, they're often shown wearing traditional festival clothes or a headband associated with takoyaki vendors. A more subtle Japanese food found in the game would be the bread basket. Along with their love of curry, one of the things that surprised me the most about Japanese food culture was just how much bread they eat over there. Bakeries and baked goods are super popular, with even corner stores usually selling an assortment of individually packaged pastries like muffins and croissants and things to buy as a snack. This was another practice that took off in the immediate post-war period, as this Slate story describes in great detail. After America and Japan made peace, Japan became a huge recipient of American wheat, which was not a traditional Japanese crop, and this abundance of wheat swiftly transformed the Japanese diet, most notably through the rise of a ton of noodle-based dishes, but also through a newfound embrace of bread and other baked goods. Bread still has an aura of being a somewhat exotic and impressive symbol of Western life in contemporary Japan, though of course over the decades the Japanese have also created plenty of unique bready treats of their own. This green Koopa shell looking one over here, for instance, is probably the most iconic, uniquely Japanese pastry. It is called a melon bread because it looks a bit like a cantaloupe. The origin of the melon bread is a bit ambiguous, but it might be based on a similar pastry they have in Mexico. Of course, not everyone thinks the Japanese embrace of bread has been a good thing. I was reading about a hard-right Japanese politician the other day who was describing wheat as a corrupting Western influence that has poisoned the Japanese mind and body. All right, so one of the game's more interesting food items is simply a lunchbox, the kind a child might take with him to school. Lunchboxes have changed a lot since my day. When I was a kid, we just had these rather cheaply made plastic things where you stuff in all of your food all willy-nilly. And I remember you had to be careful about not swinging them around too vigorously because they'd only have a single weak clasp at the front that could easily explode under even the gentlest pressure. These were the plastic lunchboxes that took off in the 1950s to replace tin lunchboxes, which this lunchbox collector's guide informs me were first invented in the 1920s by the Thermos Corporation of Norwich, Connecticut. Today, however, lunchboxes tend to be more influenced by the Japanese bento box tradition, which are smaller boxes made of much sturdier plastic with much stronger clasps. On the inside, they have these distinct little compartments that you can use to separate and organize your food in the most tidy and efficient way. Bento is quite an old Japanese word and refers to the long-standing practice of carrying around meals in boxes. Accordingly, the Japanese like to think of lunchbox preparation as something of a native art form, and it's quite common to see Japanese cookbooks or magazines full of all of these beautiful photos of the most aesthetically pleasing lunchboxes. I remember when I was working over there as an English teacher, my female coworkers liked to gossip about which of the kids had the best lunchboxes and therefore who had the classiest mother. This was a lunchbox that I bought on Amazon that I thought kind of looked like the one from the game. You can see it has these very secure clasps and all these different little separated compartments. It's interesting that the food in the game's lunchbox is so American style, with a ham sandwich, apple, juice box, and cookie, which in this case is in the shape of a gear thing that is a common symbol in the game. This was more or less what I ate every day when I was in grade school, with perhaps the notable omission of our next food, milk. Milk has been a staple of the mainstream American middle-class diet since the late 18th century, when the leading dietitians of the time began to tout it as an essential health food that everyone should be drinking. Since refrigerators didn't exist back then, a lot of Americans obeyed these instructions by signing up for daily milk deliveries from a traveling milkman. At first, the milkman would literally just ladle milk from a big tub into whatever container the lady of the home had lying around, but things got a lot more convenient and sanitary after 1886, which was when Dr. Thatcher of New York invented the glass milk bottle with a resealable cap. The milk bottle seen in the game is actually done in the style of Dr. Thatcher's original cap, with the little wire lever used to push the plug down and create an airtight seal. The glass milk bottle would proceed to become a proud symbol of bourgeois life in suburban America up until the 1950s, when household refrigerators became common and the need for daily milk deliveries accordingly declined, coupled with the invention of new and cheaper forms of milk containers, particularly the revolutionary milk carton. You can still buy milk in glass bottles to this day, but it has become more of a higher-end thing for those willing to spend a bit more for the sake of environmentally sustainable packaging. I bought this bottle at Whole Foods, where it cost $1.50 more than the same amount in a wax paper carton. Over in Japan, meanwhile, dairy has never been a big part of the traditional diet, as it hasn't been part of the traditional diet of most Asians. It did, however, eventually emerge as a symbol of Western-style wealth and sophistication during periods where Japan's exposure to Western ways was high. After World War II, the Japanese Socialist Party famously promised to create a society so wealthy that everyone could drink 3 glasses of milk a day. This fixation on milk as a symbol of Western-style opulence would likewise see an explosion of milk-flavored things in the late Showa years, and to this day, milk-flavored cookies and candies and things remain very popular in Japan.
これが本当のミルク。
Some of the foods in Mario Kart World have upgrades, and the upgraded version of the milk bottle is a cup of soft-serve yogurt with toppings. This is a fun dessert that you can buy at any number of do-it-yourself frozen yogurt chains that have popped up in recent years. My favorite is Menchie's, which was founded in LA in 2007. Frozen yogurt, or froyo, first achieved a mainstream popularity in America during the health-conscious 1980s, where it was considered a bit of a fad food for yuppies looking for a lower-calorie alternative to ice cream, but clearly it's withstood the tests of time. Yogurt itself is, of course, a much older food, originating from the Middle East and Southeastern Europe, where it's been eaten for centuries. Much like cheese, it is a food that reflects the way that dairy products tended to be consumed in solidified form prior to refrigeration. I mean, yogurt's basically just milk that's gone sour and mushy. The mainstreaming of yogurt in America is usually credited to a family of Greek Jews known as the Carasso family. They fled Europe during the war and founded a highly successful yogurt chain based out of New York in 1942, known as Danone. In those early days, yogurt, or as it was sometimes patronizingly described to skeptical Americans, milk food, was initially delivered door to door in glass bottles, just like milk. And speaking of dairy, there is obviously an ice cream cone in the game as well, because I mean, how could there not be? Easily one of the most iconic foods on Earth at this point, ice cream is now often even used as a generic symbol for food itself, at least in America. Iced-based desserts have been around forever, but ice cream as we know it today is mostly a product of industrial manufacturing and industrial refrigeration technologies developed in the late 19th century. You can see in this article from 1928, commenting on America's ice cream boom, they mention how 75 years ago, ice cream was a novelty with no status as a food, whereas by the late 20s, it had become a $650 million industry. That was a lot of money back then. America's first ice cream factory was established in 1851 in Pennsylvania by a guy named Jacob Fussell. Initially, it had just been a milk factory that had made so much milk they had to freeze some of it, and then Jake was like, hey, wait a sec. The growth of the American ice cream industry was one of the great food success stories of the 20th century, to the point where the International Dairy Foods Association says that the average American now eats about 20 pounds of ice cream a year. To put that in perspective, the average American is only said to eat 10 pounds of carrots a year. Most of us now live in a golden age of choice when it comes to ice cream options. My favorite place here in Vancouver is Rain or Shine ice cream in Kitsilano, which has this incredible malted milk chocolate honeycomb flavor. So good. Talking of sweets that you eat with one hand, how about that great American classic, the Candied apple? In the game, it's one of the ones with the red sugar glaze, but over here I could only find one of these caramel ones at the Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory. Candied apples first debuted in American candy stores and holiday parties in the early 20th century, and I suspect are mostly a relic of the fact that apples themselves weren't considered very sweet until relatively recently, as we will discuss in more detail later. For many decades, these things were considered a very iconic Halloween treat in particular. But then, of course, there was a big moral panic in the late 20th century that bad people were sticking razor blades in these things, and that basically tanked their reputation. I very distinctly remember as a child being lectured that under no circumstances was I to accept any candied apples when I was trick-or-treating. I should only eat candied apples at carnivals, which had been prepared by trustworthy carnies. And while we're on the sweet track, why don't we talk about this one, the Tower of Donuts. You can see I made my own attempt using some donuts from Lee's, which is Vancouver's most beloved donut chain. Their strawberry glazed donuts have been basically my favorite thing for my entire life. Donuts are a uniquely American pastry that is said to have originated out of New England from the fried bread traditions of early European settlers, particularly the French and Dutch. There is a lot of fanciful folklore about why donuts have holes, but it most likely just emerged as a way to make them cook and dry faster. Their breakthrough into mainstream mass American life is usually credited to the early 20th century, when diners serving coffee and cheap eats first really started to take off in American cities, and particularly the 1920s, which was when the automatic donut making machine was invented. Most of the big American donut chains arose during the mid-century period, and this is actually how the food made it to Japan as well. It was the Massachusetts-based Mr. Donut that was the first American donut chain to expand to Japan, and it took the country by such storm that within a few years there were more Mr. Donuts in Japan than America, and it switched to becoming a primarily Japanese franchise.
Mr. Donuts.
Today, I don't think most Americans have ever heard of Mr. Donut, but certainly everyone in Japan has, which is kind of a weird business story, eh? I wonder if there are any other examples of companies that have been swallowed up by their foreign expansion in a similar way. Now, you just know there had to be pizza in this game, right? Pizza is probably the world's most famous Italian food, although pizza historians will be quick to tell you that it's really more of an Italian-American food in practice. The style of rich, cheesy, saucy, meaty pizza that we all know and love today was largely created by Italian immigrants to the United States in the late 19th century and would have seemed weird and exotic to Italians back in the old country for most of their history. This business of serving pizza on one of these wooden paddle type things is often seen as a bit of a modern affectation to make it seem like pizza has a longer and more rustic history than it actually does. On the other hand, this type of personal-sized pizza, which I got from my friends over at Ignite Pizza in Gastown might seem like a modern creation as well, but it's actually the more traditional style. The earliest Italian pizzas were just handheld flatbreads, while the sort of giant shareable pizzas we have today are the more recent idea dreamed up by American restaurant chains. The Japanese are very fond of pizza, having embraced it during the Showa times, during that big post-war influx of American wheat that we mentioned earlier. In the game, the pizzas all have shrimp on them, which is a very common topping in Japan, and the bigger pizzas are divided up into multiple different flavors. That's a very common thing to do with pizza in Japan, but it hasn't caught on here for whatever reason. And what kind of game would have pizza but no burgers? Burgers are another iconic food, usually associated with immigrants to America, though their precise origins are kind of murky. Before Germany was unified as a single country, immigrants from that part of the world came from all of these little independent nations, with the Free State of Hamburg being one. And as Germans began to arrive in America in large numbers during the 19th century, something known as the hamburger steak began to catch on. These were eventually made into hamburger sandwiches with buns, and then eventually just burgers. The first dedicated burger restaurants started to be founded in the early 20th century, including my favorite, White Spot, which is a popular Vancouver chain established in 1928. Are you guys having a good time so far? Don't worry, we still got plenty more fun foods to get through. Pancakes, for instance. The English word pancake is a very old term that's been used to describe all sorts of different types of pan-fried cakes and fritters for hundreds of years. But according to this book, Pancakes, A Global History, pancakes as we know them today seem to have emerged from Holland during the 17th century and were then imported to New England, where they became a mainstream part of early colonial life. This was in large part due to the fact that they're pretty easy to make, relying as they do primarily on flour, forged from the abundant grains of the American East Coast, including wheat, oats, corn, and buckwheat. They were a particularly popular food for early American pioneers, lumberjacks, cowboys, and other cliched characters who lived off the land with nothing more than a heart full of dreams and a cast iron pan full of hog oil. The most iconic modern pancake topping, maple syrup, is very tied to the New World as well. A delicious treat born from the vast sugar maple forests that occupy eastern North America, which was of course also the first part of this continent to be colonized by the Europeans. Good old Canada is the world's biggest producer of maple syrup, with 70% of it made in just one province, Quebec. The rest of the world's supply comes mostly from the American state of Vermont. If you're thinking that these pancakes look maybe a little ridiculously fluffy, it's because I got them at the Fua Fua Pancake Shop. They are Japanese souffle style pancakes, which has been a real trend over there since the 2000s. All right, so this next one is one of the weirder foods in the game. It's a bunch of treats on what's usually called a tea stand, associated with what the British call high tea. You can see I bought one from Amazon. They're not that hard to find. In addition to being a drink, in British English, we know that tea can also sometimes refer to a late day meal, like lunch or dinner, though it's my understanding that this use of the term is sort of falling out of fashion in modern day England. Outside of the UK, however, the world remains deeply fascinated with the idea of a proper British tea as a glamorous foreign tradition. In cities around the world, as well as in England itself, you will accordingly often see British-themed cafes promising an authentic British-style high tea, which usually winds up being some sort of overpriced meal where they give you a china teapot with Lady Diana's face on it, and then haul out one of these things full of cucumbers, sandwiches, and strawberry tarts. This concept of high tea was inspired by the very formal dining traditions of the British upper class during the Victorian Age, a time when even midday snacking with friends became this big proper event with beautiful cutlery and gorgeously crafted treats and everyone using their most elegant and refined manners. It was super posh, but not as unobtainably posh as, say, fox hunting. So even back in the day, a lot of middle-class people would do their own version of afternoon tea, or what we on this continent usually call a tea party. I didn't have time to go there for this video, But over on Vancouver Island, they have this very famous Victorian-era hotel known as the Empress, and the British-style high tea they serve there every day from 11 to 5 is often listed in travel books as one of the must-do tourist experiences here in British Columbia. There is a certain sort of tourist who always wants Canada to be more British than it is, and this is a good way to appease them. Another one of the game's more gimmicky foods is the popcorn and soda you can pick up at the movie theater level. Popcorn and soda are, of course, today the quintessential movie snack. I got these at Vancouver's Tinseltown Theatre. It's not that great of a theatre, but they did let me buy snacks without buying a movie ticket, so they got that going for them. It's pretty obvious why we might want to drink soda at the movies, given we drink soda everywhere else, but why popcorn, of all things? Corn is a plant that is indigenous to North America, long domesticated by the Native Americans and famously introduced to the early white settlers as a versatile foodstuff. But according to this book, Popped Culture, A Social History of Popcorn, the practice of heating dried corn kernels until they exploded didn't become a common way of cooking corn until the 1840s. Since corn was abundant in America, and sugar often wasn't, salted, buttered, or spiced popcorn became the sort of cheap and convenient snack that was popular with common people in the mid-19th century. American society then grew steadily wealthier as the century progressed, and that's when you started to see popcorn get drenched in more decadent toppings like melted caramel or colorful candy syrups. In short, there's no particularly exciting reason why popcorn is served in movie theaters. By the time motion pictures and cinemas first went mainstream in the early 20th century, popcorn was already pretty well established as a popular snack in American culture, and something Americans were already accustomed to buying when they went to the circus or a play or an outdoor festival. Movie theaters followed a trend, they didn't create one. All right, so another snack you might get at the movies is chocolate, and the game features 3 different chocolate bars. Cacao beans, the core ingredient of chocolate, brought over to Europe from Central America, but for a long time they were primarily used to make a bitter coffee-like drink. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that the Europeans invented so-called eating chocolate, a solid foodstuff made from combining cacao bean powder and butter with sugar and milk. In 1900, the world's first chocolate bar was invented by a guy from Pennsylvania named Milton Hershey. Much like those potato chip magnates from a while back, Hershey was one of many Northeastern entrepreneurs who sought to make use of the technology of the late Industrial Revolution to mass-produce affordable treats for America's growing middle class. He is usually credited with inventing a distinctly American flavor of chocolate as well, which features more sugar and less cacao compared to what they eat in Europe. There is a chocolate bar that I bought from the Japanese import store. It is from the Meiji brand, which is Japan's most iconic. The Meiji Corporation started selling chocolate in 1926, which is actually after the Meiji era ended, but the name was picked to evoke nostalgia for Japan's late 19th century and the sort of exciting Western products that define that age, including chocolate. The game also features a bar of white chocolate. White chocolate is basically what you get when you attempt to make chocolate without cacao powder. So it's just cacao butter mixed with sugar and milk. The European Nestle Corporation takes credit for inventing white chocolate in 1936, an idea that was apparently just a byproduct of all of the excess milk powder they had left over after overproducing for World War I. And there is a bar of strawberry chocolate as well. I feel like you don't see that type of chocolate very much on this continent, but it's very popular in Japan, as you can see from this strawberry chocolate treat I bought with all the little Sanrio characters on it. Strawberry chocolate is basically just white chocolate with strawberry flavoring added. All right, we are in the closing stretch now. Next up, we got 3 canned drinks, beginning with what appears to be some sort of generic canned soda. Based on the design of the can, I think it might be intended to be a parody of Calpis, which is a very popular but very unfortunately named Japanese yogurt soda that first debuted in 1919. According to their corporate website, their creator had been inspired to make a yogurt-flavored soda during a trip to Mongolia, which is another part of the world with a big yogurt eating culture. Soda itself was a drink that was first developed at Victorian-era pharmacies and drugstores in the eastern US. Take-home soda was almost exclusively sold in glass bottles until the 1950s, at which point aluminum cans became the preferred container. According to periodictable.com, about 8% of the Earth's surface is made of aluminium, making it our planet's most abundant type of metal. Next up, a can of coffee. I don't think you see canned coffee much over here, but in Japan, it's a very hot thing. Quite literally, it's often sold in these special heated vending machines that dispense scalding hot cans. It's a system that takes a little bit of getting used to. The idea of canned coffee was first dreamed up in 1969 by the Ueshima Coffee Corporation, who you can see also made this can. The UCC figured that canned coffee would offer Japanese commuters a quick and convenient way to enjoy their coffee on their morning trip on the subway. There was no Starbucks in those days, and the Japanese coffee shops that did exist were generally considered fancy places, more like sit-down restaurants. Indeed, the classiness of Showa-era coffee shops has now become a huge source of Japanese nostalgia as overall coffee culture has degraded. Coffee, for its part, is a very ancient drink that originates from the Middle East, where it was once known as Islamic wine. It was imported by the Europeans in the 17th century, who promptly became addicted to it. According to this issue of Food Culture magazine, coffee has always been bound up in the culture of work, since the usefulness of caffeine as a stimulant has been known from the start. And lastly, there's a can of apple juice. I remember drinking canned juice a lot as a kid, but it's quite a bit less common these days, probably because the juice companies like to downplay their products' similarity to soda. The only place where I could find a can of apple juice was at T&T, a popular Asian food chain. So I guess that says something. Apples were first actively cultivated at a large scale during the settlement of the American Midwest in the 19th century. But for a long time, American apples were so bitter that they were just primarily used to make liquor. Apple cider was dubbed the American wine because of how ubiquitous it was during Victorian America. It was only when Prohibition was imposed in the 1920s that the big American apple cider producers began shifting to selling alcohol-free juice, which ultimately proved to be a better long-term business model, especially as apple breeding got better and apples literally grew sweeter. According to this news story from the 1960s, the American apple juice industry grew nearly 2,000% from 1939 to 1962. So we're all thinking a lot about Donkey Kong right now, and Mario Kart World's Donkey Kong themed levels have a couple pretty unique foods you can get. One is kebabs, or as I grew up calling them, shish kebabs. Kebab is an ancient Middle Eastern term of unclear origin and meaning. In the Muslim world, it's often used to describe any kind of roasted meat. But over here, I feel like it's mostly used to describe roasted meat served on a skewer. Shish is the Turkish word for skewer, so that's where that comes from. There are lots of countries that have traditions of cooking some sort of shish kebab looking thing. All things considered, it's a pretty basic and obvious way of serving meat that's been occurring to people for millennia. Here, for example, is an iron skewer they dug up in France that's over 2,000 years old. Considerably grander is this opulent baked ham with pineapple and egg. Given that Donkey Kong lives in a tropical type world, I think this is supposed to evoke a sort of stereotypically Polynesian type meal. Pigs have lived in the islands of the South Pacific for thousands of years, probably dating back to when they were first settled by ancient humans from Asia. Historically, pork has tended to be a very heavily sentimentalized meat over there, with cooking and eating a pig often associated with big, important occasions like weddings or coming-of-age ceremonies. In the context of Hawaii, the most famous Polynesian society, a traditional feast of this sort is called a luau and features a roasted pig cooked in a traditional in-ground oven. Hawaii experienced a huge tourism boom in the 1960s after becoming an American state, which then saw their centuries-old luau tradition get reimagined into a mass-produced spectacle for tourists. This then raised awareness of luau-style ham as a glamorous and exotic dish on the American mainland, which the ever-creative mid-century housewives of America reimagined into a roasted ham from the supermarket with some pineapple slices stuck on, like this one that I got my talented friend Kaylin to spend all day preparing just for this brief moment of B-roll. All right, and then the last DK Jungle treat is this, the smoothie bowl. Smoothie bowls are an outgrowth of the great smoothie craze that swept America in the late 90s and 2000s as part of the larger craze towards more wholesome, healthy foods made of natural ingredients that helped make things like sushi and banana chips popular. Smoothies are, of course, normally consumed as drinks, but sometime in the 2000s, it became increasingly popular to eat them in bowl form too, which allowed for the addition of more unblended toppings, making them more like ice cream sundaes or something. I like the creamy nutty bowl they serve at this place called Glory Juice in Vancouver. It has bananas and granola and honey. The smoothie bowl tradition has a lot of overlap with acai bowls, which got popular around the same time. The difference is just that acai bowls are primarily made of blended acai berries, which is a type of fruit from Brazil that earned great acclaim in the late 2000s as the world's healthiest superfood, which is to say something that would cure all of your problems if you ate enough of them. I like how in Donkey Kong's acai bowl, he has 2 slices of star fruit done up like superstars. Star fruit being another exotic superfood that became increasingly well-known in America over the last decade. Clearly the secret behind DK's stunning physique. And that's it. The story behind all of the incredible foods from Mario Kart World. Let me know in the comments if you have any other fun facts you want to share about any of these foods, or if you have any other ideas for equally gimmicky ideas I could do for future videos. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a lot of eating to